powerful in and of themselves, but it's also a great analogy for life. It really is. You may be in the driver's seat, but the truth is we've got to jump out of this race of life time and time again to follow God's dream for our lives, to get our center again and to move back into the race. It's interesting how many of you had some power outages and maybe some trees in your backyard this week. Yeah. Well, I did too. And it just so happened, well, no, I didn't. I'm in a condo. It was somebody else's problem. It was beautiful, just beautiful. One of the gifts. And it was interesting to me because I've been reading Isaiah. And so yesterday I was reading Isaiah on the back porch, and I heard all the chainsaws ring, everywhere. Do you guys know how the prophet Isaiah was put to death? It wasn't a chainsaw, it was just a regular saw. So I pray for the prophetess today, and I hope I don't see any chainsaws out there because we're going to spend a little time with the prophets. And the prophets always had a lot to say that people didn't want to hear. So get comfortable, because in a way I pray you're going to get a little uncomfortable. In Isaiah 43, chapter 19, verse 19, he says, "Forget what's happened. Don't keep going over old history. Be alert, be present. I'm about to do something brand new." This is God. It's bursting out. Don't you see it? There it is. I'm making a road through the desert, rivers in the Badlands. So, of course, next weekend is that 103rd running of the 500 where the cars go around and around and around. The Orlando Sentinel asked the drivers of actually the Daytona 500, what is it that you think about for all that time you're in the car? Well, Jimmy Johnson said, for the most part, he thinks about the race, but he had to admit that periodically he gets hungry. So hungry that Gatorade created a special thing just for him, and the other drivers use it now, that has kind of this fluid system. One of the Gatorade products has a lot of sugar in it so he can have energy. The next one has a lot of protein in it so that he won't be hungry. And he says it works pretty well. I didn't stick around to find out what happens to when it goes around, but that doesn't matter. But he said it works pretty good. But do you know what? Sometimes you're just plain old hungry. So the next time you watch Jimmy Johnson race, I want to encourage you because periodically there's a member of his pit team that will give him a sandwich or something when he comes in for the pit stop. I mean, sometimes it's important to get something to eat when you're running around a track at hundreds, 200 miles an hour, because probably the worst thing in the world would be to have a hangry driver there, wouldn't it? I wonder if the same is true about life, about this race we call life. I mean, it's hard to concentrate on the daily race we run when we are hungry. In fact, studies show that kids cannot concentrate when they're hungry. Mike reminded us that there are a lot of people in this country and in this world who are running the race of life, and they're hungry, and we wonder why they're hangry. So, folks, I'm going to lay it out there today. People in the world today are hungry, and Jesus has a few mandates, but one really important mandate for the church, and that is to feed the hungry. Now, I'm going to be really clear here. We had Mike come up here and share in this letter writing thing because it's political, right? It's a letter to your politician. And our studies show, we have studied this congregation, you don't like politics in the pulpit or in the music stand. You just don't like that. You don't like politics in the music stand. But remember, I've been reading Isaiah this week, thinking about him and the chainsaws rolling. And then I got a call. I do a camp every summer, and I'm the chaplain at this camp, and I preach twice a day. And the president of the board of that camp called me this week and said, Carolyn, it's the best preaching we've ever had, ever. People love your preaching. But if you could, keep the politics out of it, that would be helpful. God speaks to me in a variety of ways. Why don't you want politics here? Because it's messy, right? It's messy. And most of us in the world have an opinion when it comes to politics. But I have to tell you, politics have been part of culture from the very beginning of time. Throughout the Bible, we're witness to these guys who are speaking out against something that they believe is unjust. Isaiah, as I mentioned before, he's just one of many. Most prophets were martyred, and what is martyred? That means that they were killed for the cause that they were fighting for. Not only them, but do you know that all 12 disciples were martyred as well? And of course, Jesus. Why? Because they were all saying things that people would rather not hear. And they gave their lives to share in the message of the love of God. The truth is, in this life, we don't like to hear about things that we do not understand and we feel like we can't do anything about. Things that are painful. We have no cable in our bedroom, but we have a TV with one of those antenna things. And it's interesting to me how when you turn on the regular TV these days to some of those stations that you don't really watch on a regular basis, that there are still those ads that make you so uncomfortable. The ad with the dog, right? The ad with the dog that I immediately turn off because I don't want to know that dogs live like that. And then the little kid crying and hungry and belly full. I turn it off because I don't like seeing that. I don't know how to save the children. I don't know how to save the animals. But the truth is, the problem still exists even if I turn it off. The problem still exists, and we don't know how to deal with it, so we just turn it off. Now, what we do is we elect people to represent us in seeking and bringing solutions to those problems, don't we? And we put them in office because they can take care of this. Yet, as people of faith, the truth about life is that we have a responsibility. We have a mandate that we are called to deal with the problems of this world ourselves, not somebody else. We, as people of faith, recognize that Jesus has left us this mandate, and it's pretty clear. He tells us to free the captives, to feed the hungry, to house the homeless, to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. He calls us to care for the widow and the orphan, to have a special place in this world for children. He doesn't say that's somebody else's job. He says it's anybody who refers to themselves as Christian or faithful, it's your job. God has been working in the world in this way from the beginning of time. I personally believe that God is in the process, something that they call process theology. So that when God created this earth, God created the earth in such a way that God gave us what we needed to create a place where people could be equal, people could have enough to eat, a creation that could care for itself. That's what God did. And God was bold enough to include us in the process by giving us this thing called free will and intellect and all those amazing things. Not only that, but God is a liberation God, which means we live in a liberation theology. And that means that we not only have to do this to work in the process of the world, but we can't do it on the backs of somebody else. If I come into power on the back of somebody else, that's not God. So we have to find a way to work in the process and in a way that liberates everybody. God says, be alert. I am at work here. I'm doing a new thing. It's bursting out. Don't you see it? Nope, because we're too busy doing our own thing. See, the truth about life is that we lose sight of what God has in store for this world. We get overwhelmed. We turn the channel. We say this is somebody else's job, and we pass on the responsibility. In his book, Dangerous Calling, Paul David Tripp says this. He says, I'm convinced that the big crisis for the Church of Jesus Christ is not that we are easily dissatisfied, but that we are all too easily satisfied. We have a regular and perverse ability to make things work that are not and should not be working. We learn to adjust the things that we should alter. We learn to be okay with things we should be confronting. We learn how to avoid things we should be facing. We would rather be comfortable than hold people accountable. We swindle ourselves into thinking that things are better than they are, and in doing so, we compromise the calling and standards of the God we say we love and serve. Like sick people who are afraid to go to the doctor, we collect evidence that points to our health when really, in our heart of hearts, we know we are sick. So we settle for human second best when God, in grace, offers us so much more. So the question today is, when it comes to issues of hunger in the world, have we settled for second best when God's grace has so much more in store? Are we saying this is someone else's problem? Are we saying this is politics and it doesn't have a place here? Now, before you turn me off, before you pull out that list to start working on your Costco shopping list, just hang in there for me, would you? Hang in there, because God is doing a new thing. Sit there and be a little uncomfortable. Now, as a pastor of the United Methodist Church, I'm called to preach, teach, lead, interpret Scripture, counsel, marry, bury, and uphold the discipline. I have to be totally honest with you. I'm having a pretty hard time with one of those elements right now, and it's not preaching the gospel. And it's political. It's a political topic that the United Methodist Church is dealing with. We have recently, yes, it's actually true now, we have legislated, put together legislation that excludes LGBTQI people. But I have to tell you, that's not the politics that I'm going to get into today. If you're interested in getting into it, we can do that in the hall. Why? Because we have bigger political fish to fry. And not only do we need to fry them, but we need to fry them and feed them to hungry people. Yes, hunger is political. It goes back probably to the beginning of time, but in this country, we can see how God did a new thing just about 40 years ago. And God did God's very best work in this country with humans when they had a willingness to give up control and let God take over. 40 years ago, these two guys on opposite side of the aisle, they were pinned against each other in everything, particularly the Vietnam War. They were fiercely divided. Bob Dole and George McGovern had some fierce battles. In fact, they say that their battles were so fierce, never had there been words spoken or images shared on the floor of the Senate like these two shared during the Vietnam War. But that which divided them was not as strong as the gospel message to feed the hungry, and that brought them together. See, they came together to address hunger in the U.S., perhaps from different angles. Dole had great concern for the farmers, McGovern concern for the poor and the hungry. But because they were open and God did a new thing, they were able to make a difference. Not only on the topic of hunger, but on the common mission, vision, and goal that God created, a bipartisan friendship that would last a lifetime. Dole and McGovern worked to overhaul the laws dealing with, and they created food stamps and lunches for kids at school 40 years ago. Not only that, but they put their actions into such a way that they were able to move into God's unlimited grace and have an impact on hunger around the world. Because of their actions 40 years ago, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe now have a relationship with the U.S. that ensures that people will be fed. These two men remind us that love for neighbor is much greater than a political difference. Common goals based on a desire to live out the gospel, that's where true life happens. That's where God does God's best work in making something new. I'm going to get political. Today, our government does not seem to be working in a manner such as this. We have decided that party lines in a country where it's okay for a few to have a lot while the tired, the hungry, and the poor continue to suffer. We've decided in some way that's someone else's responsibility, and that's okay. Well, friends, your faith and God's grace are greater than division. Personally and collectively, we need to remind our leaders what true leadership looks like. It's believing that God is working in the world today in ways where there is enough, more than enough for all people. If we communicate, care about one another, and find a way through this hunger crisis, we can lead the world in a place where we again care about our creation, care about our grandchildren, care about everybody who's hungry, and believe that God wants to feed them all and will use the likes of us. Somewhere we have lost this along the way, and I think in some ways when I look at the actions of our politicians, it's because we're functioning in fear and scarcity rather than love and abundance. You've heard me preach it before, and you'll hear me preach it again. 1 John 4:8 says that perfect love casts out fear. We have a choice in all of our living. Either we can function in fear or we can function in love. Which do you choose? In that same book I quoted earlier, Dangerous Calling, Tripp notes, fear can overwhelm your senses. It can distort your thinking. It can kidnap your desires. It can capture your meditation so that you spend more time worrying about what others think than about what God has called you to be. Today, God is calling us as a community of faith to step out in love, to remind people that fear does not win, to act in love. I believe that the powerful are fearful, and they need to be reminded that God is a God of love, and God has called each and every one of us to care for the least, the last, and the lost. It is a Christian call, and it has a great political history. And we can look back at bipartisan leaders who had the courage to step up in love and not in fear. In fact, Hubert Humphrey once said this. He said, "The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are on the dawn of life, the children, those who are at the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadow of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped." There is a lot going on in our world today, and through it all, God continues to do a new thing through me, through you, through the church, through the garden, and yes, bless you, through the government in which you have a voice. So what now? What now that your pastor has encouraged you to wiggle a little in your seat and perhaps not come back? I beg you not to turn the channel. I beg you to step into action, for then you will experience what God is doing anew and you will be transformed. First, you have the opportunity here, as Mike said, to write a letter. You have time. We have one service. You can sit at that table right here, right now, and remind your political leaders in a world where the gospel of love rules, there is nothing to fear. Pause for a moment and tell the story of McGovern and Dole. Remind them that there was nothing to fear, that these two found a way to come together. Tell them about Gardens, where we have this small community that has somehow put together 15 garden beds where 100% of that produce goes to people who are hungry at Crooked Creek Food Pantry. Not only that, but 100% of the labor is provided by people who believe that God is doing something new. Friends, our leaders are stuck on a track going round and round, watching for each turn, watching who's going to get in their way, around and around and around. Perhaps if we step out or even step in front of them with belief, what will God do? I want you to encourage leaders, to thank them for their service in a really difficult time in our country and in our community. I want you to remind them of the hope in the world and how you are working in hope and in God's promise. I know you're not only working in gardens, but you're making a difference somehow, somewhere. Remind them how this action gives you life and breath and movement and really helps you move forth. Let's encourage our government today to take a pit stop and to be reminded that they may have some good ideas, but God's are much better. That we will not settle for second best, but only the best for God's children, God's elderly, the widow, those in need. Today is the day where we're reminded that the pen is mightier than the sword, where we're reminded that indeed you can not only text your friends, but you can text Susan Brooks or whoever it may be. Follow your heart today and believe that God is doing a new thing and needs your help in doing so. Amen.